In the spring of 1943, the 7-mile aerodrome at Port Moresby, New Guinea was not a place where miracles were born. It was a graveyard for machines. Heat pressed down on the runway like lead, aircraft skins hot enough to burn bare hands, the air thick with the stench of rotting vegetation, rusting iron, and soldiers who had not bathed in a week. At the far end of the airfield, away from the busy flight lines, sat the 5th Air Force airplane graveyard, piled high with wrecked Japanese fighters and B-17 bombers that the sky had spat back out. Some were missing wings, others were riddled with bullet holes, all of them being cannibalized for parts to keep a handful of planes flying. In the center of this scrap, heaps at one aircraft that had been torn apart so thoroughly that nobody wanted to go near it. It was a B-17, serial number 40-12666, and its fuselage number was 66666. For superstitious airmen, the number alone was enough to make them turn and walk away. But the curse of this airplane ran far deeper than its number. When it first arrived in the Pacific Theater, it was overweight, flew like a runaway truck, slow and clumsy, struggled to climb, turned sluggishly. Pilots complained that it wobbled in the air, refused to gain altitude, and did not want to fight. It was dumped in the graveyard, forgotten, eaten by rain and tropical humidity. The war had long since abandoned it. They called it the Queen of Scrap. The experts said it was garbage, and its only purpose was to donate parts to other aircraft. Every time someone walked past airplane 666, they instinctively quickened their pace, as if getting too close would rub off on them. Jay Zeamer was not an expert. He was a troublemaker. Zeamer did not fit the standard template for an airman. He was 34 years old, older than most young men who piloted heavy bombers, and his stubborn temper was legendary. He disliked formation flying, disliked waiting for orders, and suffered from chronic insomnia. So every night he wandered around the hangars, taking things apart, modifying things, and driving the mechanics crazy. He was not the type to sit in a bar and brag. He was the type who would quietly repair his crapped airplane until it could fly again. In the Pacific Theater, misfits like Zeamer usually did not last long, but Zeamer outlasted everyone through sheer stubbornness. He did not rely on luck. He relied on an almost obsessive persistence, a stubborn faith in the impossible. Zeamer set his sights on 666, not because he liked it, but because there was no other choice. This airplane was the only B-17 in the graveyard that had not yet been completely stripped for parts. It sat there waiting, as if it had been waiting for him all along. He needed a platform, an airplane of his own, one he could modify his way. He gathered his crew, a group of equally eccentric misfits, and began rebuilding this cursed B-17. They stole parts from the graveyard, stripped equipment from other aircraft, and even scavenged usable components from crashed enemy planes, sneaking around at night to haul their loot, then acting as if nothing had happened during the day. Nobody asked, and they did not tell. The craziest part was that Zeamer added machine guns to this airplane, not just 1 or 2, but 19 in total, far exceeding the standard configuration. He mounted guns in the nose, waist, belly, and tail, practically every spot that could hold a gun. He turned this bomber into a flying porcupine. The crew members were not normal either. The bombardier, Joseph Aronowski, was a quiet miner's son with astonishing marksmanship. The navigator was a Hothid who had been kicked out of 3 squadrons. The mechanic was a madman who could fix engines in the middle of a storm. Every gunner had a disciplinary record, and every one of them was someone else's reject. But Zeamer did not care. He did not want obedient soldiers. He wanted fighters who could survive in hell. They spent weeks transforming the Queen of Scrap into a monster, and the ground crews started calling it the Porcupine, because it was covered in quills and would stab you if you touched it. After the modifications, Zeamer began taking the crew on missions, but not regular ones. They flew the dirty jobs nobody else wanted, low-altitude reconnaissance, single aircraft penetrating deep behind enemy lines, no escort, no cover. The brass had mixed feelings about Zeamer. On one hand, his reconnaissance photos were of exceptional quality. On the other hand, His behavior was completely undisciplined. He disobeyed orders, acted on his own, led his crew straight into Japanese air defense networks, snapped his photos and ran, returning every time riddled with bullet holes, but with perfect photographs every single time. Other pilots started noticing that the cursed 6.6 did not seem cursed anymore. It flew more steadily, the crew worked together more smoothly, and those 19 machine guns delivered astonishing firepower in combat. But the real test was still ahead. In June of 1943, the 5th Air Force received a nearly impossible mission. They needed detailed aerial reconnaissance of Bougainville Island to provide intelligence for a future landing operation. The problem was that Bougainville was the most heavily fortified Japanese stronghold in the Solomon Islands, with dense anti-aircraft defenses and frequent fighter patrols. Previous aircraft assigned to similar missions had a survival rate of less than 30%. The commanders hesitated. Who would go? Zeamer stepped forward. He said he and his crew could do it. His superiors refused, saying it was too dangerous, that his airplane was unsuitable, and that his men were not professional enough. Zeamer did not listen. He went straight to a higher-ranking general and used his trademark stubbornness and silver tongue to win him over. It was said that Zeamer stood in the general's office that day, pointed at Bougainville on the map, and said that if they did not let him go, nobody would come back alive with those photographs. The general was silent for a long time, then finally nodded. The mission was set for June 16th. Zeamer and his crew would fly 666, alone, deep into the skies over Bougainville, photograph the Japanese defenses at low altitude, and come back alive. On the day of takeoff before dawn, the crew arrived at the airfield. They checked every machine gun, every line, every inch of the aircraft. Sarnowski silently cleaned his gun sight in the nose. The navigator double-checked the route. The mechanic performed one final engine inspection. Everyone knew this might be the last time, but nobody said it out loud. Silence carried more weight than any words. Zeamer climbed into the cockpit and started the engines. The 4 old Wright Cyclone engines coughed a few times, then roared to life, and the entire aircraft trembled with vibration like a beast being awakened. 6.6 rolled down the runway, accelerated, lifted off, and disappeared into the grayed-on sky. On the ground, a mechanic watched it go and whispered, "God help those crazy bastards." After flying for several hours, they arrived over Bougainville and began descending to execute the reconnaissance mission. The cameras started working, film frame by frame, recording the Japanese deployments below. Then, hell descended. Irate station spotted them. Alarms blared across Bougainville. Japanese fighters scrambled, not just a few, but 17's Eurofighters, like a pack of hungry sharks bearing down on this lone bomber. The first attack came head-on. 2 Zeros dove straight at them, cannons spitting fire. Zeamer shoved the control stick forward, and 6.66 banked hard, bullets whipping past both sides of the nose. But a 3rd Euro sliced in from the flank, and a burst of cannon shells tore through the fuselage, sending fragments flying. Sarnowski fired back from the nose, his twin machine guns roaring, tracers arsing through the sky. One's arrow was hit in the fuel tank and spiraled down, trailing black smoke. But more Zeros came. They attacked from all directions, cannon shells pouring down on 6.66 like a rainstorm. Aluminum skin was torn apart, lines worse evered, shell casings clattered across the cabin floor, and smoke filled the interior. A0 closed in from 6 o'clock. The waist gunners slipped on spent shell casings underfoot, calling out targets to each other. In the nose, Sarnowski was dying. The shrapnel wound in his abdomen was fatal, and he knew it. Everyone knew it. He had collapsed earlier, but the sound of gunfire woke him. He dragged himself back to his station, crawled to the flexible machine gun. A Japanese fighter, thinking the nose gunner was dead, arrogantly crossed in front of the bomber at low speed, banking to expose its belly. It was a fatal mistake. Sarnowski opened fire. He did not have the strength for precision aiming, but his instincts remained. He walked his tracers into the Zero's fuel tank. and the Japanese fighter exploded instantly, vanishing in a ball of orange flame. Sarnoski slumped against the cabin wall, exhausted, yet still gripping the trigger, refusing to leave his post. The battle continued. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. In aerial combat, dogfights usually last only seconds, but this was a marathon. The Japanese were relentless. They destroyed the hydraulic system, which meant the landing gear and brakes were gone. They destroyed the oxygen system, which at 25,000 feet was critical. The air was too thin to breathe, and without an oxygen mask, a person would lose consciousness in minutes. Jay Zeamer realized the danger. They had to descend, but diving would sacrifice their altitude advantage and plunge them directly into ground anti-aircraft fire. He made his decision, pushing the nose down not in a steep dive, but in a shallow high-speed descent, trading altitude for speed to try to shake off the swarm. The heavy bomber accelerated, the airframe groaning under the pressure, wind howling through the shattered nose, freezing the blood on Sarnoski's uniform. Jay Zeamer fought the controls. Without hydraulic power, he had to rely on pure mechanical linkages, muscling the 30-ton aircraft with brute force, every turn and correction sending agony through his shattered legs. The Japanese stayed right behind them. They sensed a kill, seeing number 3 engine smoking, seeing tail fragments peeling away, and pressed their attack. A-0 closed in from the tail, slipping into the blind spot, its cannons hammering the rudder. Tail gunner Sergeant Pugh had been waiting. He had stayed silent, conserving ammunition, and now he opened fire, not just shooting but surgically dismantling the enemy aircraft, blowing off the Zero's propeller. The Japanese fighter stalled and fell. Another Zero attacked from below, aiming for the ball turret, but the turret gunner had already locked on, rotating the turret to track the climbing fighter, waiting until the Zero was close before laying down a long burst. The Japanese fighter flew straight into the wall of tracers, its engine block shattered, the pilot bailing out, a white parachute blooming against the blue sky. The crew of this flying fortress worked methodically. There was no panic, only rage. They had been sent to die in a piece of junk, and they took it personally. They were going to make the Japanese pay for every inch of sky. They shot down 2-3 for fighters. The Japanese squadron was losing aircraft faster than they could have imagined. They had never seen a bomber fight like this. It was like fighting a flying warship. Jay Zeamer checked his watch. They had been fighting for 40 minutes. 40 minutes of continuous aerial combat. But ammunition was running low, the gunners were shouting warnings, and the aircraft was barely holding together. The rudder cables were worn down to a few thin strands. Jay Zeamer's consciousness was fading. Blood loss made him dizzy, his vision narrowing until he could only see the horizon, the edges of the world turning gray. He slapped his own face to stay awake. He could not die yet. He had to bring everyone home. The Japanese finally withdrew. They were low on fuel and out of ammunition, and truth be told, they were afraid. They had sent 17 of their finest fighters to attack one crippled American bomber, and the bomber had beaten them. They confirmed 5 losses and multiple damaged aircraft. They turned back toward Bougainville, leaving this smoking, broken flying fortress alone in the sky. But the battle was not over. The fight against the enemy was finished, but the fight against the airplane itself was just beginning. Jay Zeamer leveled off at low altitude and looked around the cockpit. It was a scene of devastation. Glass and blood covered every surface. Sarnoski was unconscious in the nose, breathing faintly. Every other crew member was wounded. The navigator tried to bandage Jay Zeamer's legs with a first aid kit, but the wounds were too deep. Jay Zeamer waved him often, pointed at the map. He needed a course home. Port Moresby was 400 miles away. Even in a brand new aircraft that would be a long flight, but with damaged engines, no hydraulics, and a pilot bleeding to death, it felt like eternity. The journey home was a blur of pain and silence. Jay Zeamer drifted in undoubt of consciousness. If he blacked out for even a second, the airplane would descend, and adrenaline would yank him back to reality. He hallucinated, seeing arrows in the clouds, seeing runways that were only ocean. The crew tried to help. The co-pilot offered to take the controls, but Jay Zeamer refused. He knew this airplane better than anyone, knew all its quirks. He knew the control cables were damaged and that pulling too hard would snap them, killing everyone. He had to fly it himself, by feel, using his fingertips on the controls, feeling the vibrations, keeping this dying machine in the air. They crossed the coast of New Guinea, and the Owen Stanley Mountains loomed ahead. Jay Zeamer had to climb over the mountain pass. He pushed the throttles forward. The engines protested, temperature gauges redlining, oil pressure dropping, but the old engines held. They cleared the jagged peaks with mere feet to spare above the treetops. The airfield at Port Moresby appeared in the distance. It was the most beautiful sight Jay Zeamer had ever seen. But there was a new problem. Without hydraulics, there were no brakes and no flaps. He had to land this heavy bomber at high speed with only one good leg to work the rudder. He called the tower but got no response. The radio was dead. He fired a red flare from the cockpit window to signal an emergency. Ground crews saw the crippled aircraft approaching, cleared the runway, and fire trucks and ambulances rushed into position. Jay Zeamer lined up on approach, the aircraft coming in fast. He pulled the throttles back and the wounded bomber dropped toward the ground. Jay Zeamer fought the crosswind, keeping the wings level. If a wing tip touched the ground, the airplane would cartwheel and explode. He leveled the nose and the main gear slammed onto the runway with a screech of tires. The airplane bounced, settled, and rocketed down the runway at high speed. Jay Zeamer used his good leg on the rudder to keep it straight. With no brakes, he could only rely on friction to slow down. The aircraft kept rolling, past the end of the runway, into the dirt, and finally came to a stop in a cloud of dust, just a few feet from the jungle edge. In that moment, the entire airplane seemed to exhale, its metal skeleton giving one final sigh before falling silent. The silence that followed was deafening. The engines died, the propellers stopped, and Jay Zeamer collapsed over the control column. He had done it. He had brought everyone back. He closed his eyes and let the darkness take him. He did not hear the sirens, did not hear the mechanics shouting as they ran toward the aircraft, did not see the horror on their faces when they saw what was left of it. The airplane looked like it had been used for target practice by the entire Japanese Navy. There was not a single square inch of aluminum skin without a dent, tear, or puncture. The tail was hanging on by a few strands of wire, the rudder was gone, and the wings looked like lace, riddled with holes. The nose, Sarnowski's glass office, where he had fought to his last breath, was completely shattered, exposed to the open air and covered in blood and shell casings. The mechanics started counting bullet holes. They got to 100 and stopped. They got to 150 and stopped again. The final number was staggering. 187 bullet holes and 5 large can unshell holes in the fuselage, and that was only the visible damage. Inside, the aircraft was a total wreck. Control cables worn down to the last few strands, hydraulic lines severed, oxygen tanks perforated. By every engineering principle, this airplane should have disintegrated in mid-air. The main wing spar, the solid steel bar connecting the wing to the fuselage, had cracked. If Jay Zeamer had pulled the controls just a little harder during landing, the wings would have snapped off. This airplane flew home, not on aerodynamics but on willpower. Med carefully extracted the crew from the wreckage. It was a somber scene. Jay Zeamer was not fully unconscious, but his flight suit below the waist was soaked in blood, his left leg severely damaged. Sarnowski died shortly after being carried out. He held on until the mission was complete before releasing his grip on life, his fingers still curled in the position of pulling a trigger, as if he were still fighting in another world. While doctors in the hospital tent fought desperately to save Jay Zeamer's life, intelligence officers rushed the film to the photo lab. This was the meaning of the blood, the reason for Sarnowski's sacrifice. If the photographs were blurry or the cameras destroyed, the mission would have failed. Technicians developed the film in the darkroom with trembling hands. Officers examined the images with magnifying glasses. The photographs were perfect. Despite the violent maneuvers, the machine gun vibrations, and the battle damage, Zeamer had kept the bomber steady enough to capture crystal-clear images of the Bougainville coastline. The photographs revealed everything: hidden artillery positions, reef depths, Japanese airfield locations. This was the impossible map the generals had demanded. Behind every photograph was the price of blood and life, and every inch of film was soaked with Sarnoski's last breath in the determination of Zeamer's shattered legs. Later that year, when United States Marines stormed the beaches of Bougainville, they cleared every position, destroyed every bunker, and countless American lives were saved because a crew of misfits refused to turn back when the sky was black with enemy fighters. Every coordinate point on those photographs later became a route for the Marines to advance, a target for artillery coverage, a foundation for victory. Jay Zeamer remained unconscious for several days, his body fighting shock and infection. When he finally opened his eyes, he was weakened, could not move his legs. The doctors told him he might never walk again. They told him Sarnoski was gone. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Zeamer had assembled the crew, modified the airplane, and led them into battle. He carried the heavy burden of command and the crushing guilt of a survivor. But then stories started coming in from across the squadron. The tale of that air battle had spread. Other pilots were talking about the porcupine that drove off 17's Eros, about a crew that did not know the meaning of death. The Army Air Forces could not ignore what had happened. The experts who had called this airplane garbage and this crew a bunch of troublemakers were completely humiliated by this overwhelming victory. They had to rewrite the record. Zeamer's crew became the most decorated crew in the Pacific Theater. Every man on board received medals, and the highest honors went to the pilot and the bombardier. Captain Jay Zeamer and Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnoski were both awarded the Medal of Honor, the United States military's highest decoration. It was extremely rare for two men on the same aircraft to receive this honor for the same mission, proof enough of how savage the fighting had been. The citation read, "Extraordinary heroism and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty." But words on paper could not recreate the reality inside the cockpit, could not recreate the howling of the wind through the shattered nose, could not recreate the determination of a man fighting the control column with broken legs. The war ended, and the mechanics looked at the damage and shook their heads. It was beyond repair. This time it could not be patched up. The structural damage was too severe. Airplane 66 was towed back to the graveyard, back to the scrap heap where Zeamer had first found it. But this time it was not parked with the garbage. It was respectfully placed. Its at in the tropical sun, its aluminum skin gradually fading, its weapons removed, becoming a silent monument to the blood battle of 1943. Pilots would come to look at it, run their hands over the jagged holes, stare at the fixed gun mounts on the cockpit floor, and shake their heads in wonder. This was a machine that accomplished the impossible simply because the people inside had refused to accept that it was impossible. Jay Zeamer defied the odds his entire life, just as he had defied the Japanese. He learned to walk again, a long and painful process, relying on the same stubbornness that had kept him in the air. He got back on his feet, survived the war, and returned to America as a silent hero while the nation celebrated victory. He never wrote a book, never went on a speaking tour. He lived a simple life, working in the aviation industry with the machines he loved. He eventually settled in Maine to raise a family. If you had met him in his later years, you would never have known he was a legend. He was just a quiet, gentle man who liked to sit on his porch. He never boasted about single-handedly taking on an entire enemy air force, never flaunted his Medal of Honor. He kept it in a drawer alongside old photographs, occasionally taking it out late at night for a glance, then gently closing it again. With his passing, the last living link to that terrible and glorious day over Bougainville was broken. But stories have a way of outlasting the people who lived them. The tale of this impossible airplane is still told in flight schools and mess halls, studied by historians, and whispered by mechanics. We tell this story today because it is easy to be hypnotized by specifications and statistics. On paper, airplane number 66 should have been scrap metal long ago. The manual said it was too slow, too damaged, and the crew flying it was all wrong. But numbers will never calculate a pilot who refuses to give up, will never calculate a bombardier who keeps firing while bleeding to death in the nose. You can measure horsepower and wing loading, but you cannot measure stubbornness, loyalty, and pure, unyielding fury. Jay Zeamer and his band of rebels proved that a cursed airplane is only cursed if you believe in the curse. They proved that a misfit is just a hero who has not yet found the right battlefield. They forged a weapon that shattered the Japanese defenses using a broken machine and a broken team, reminding us that in the end, it is not the airplane that makes the ace, but the ace that makes the airplane. So the next time you feel the odds are impossible, the next time the experts tell you your plan is crazy and your equipment is junk, remember the porcupine. Remember the 19 machine guns. Remember that solo strike. Remember that as long as you have fuel to fly and the courage to pull the trigger, you are never out of the fight. This is the story of airplane number 666, an aircraft abandoned by everyone, a crew rejected by everyone, that accomplished the most incredible mission in the entire Pacific theater. If you want more incredible stories of courage against impossible odds, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's most extraordinary moments. I am your history observer, and I will see you on the next battlefield. Until then, remember that legends are not born from easy victories. They are forged in the fires of impossible odds.